The morning briefing was supposed to be routine. That's what made it so dangerous. Agent Shadow had learned long ago that routine was when the machinery of espionage worked most efficiently, when everyone's guard was down, when people stopped questioning the orders they were given, when trust became so habitual that it stopped being trust and became something closer to sleep. The safe house in Moscow was technically not supposed to exist. According to all official records, the United States maintained no covert infrastructure within Russian territory. According to the intelligence community's official position, American operatives did not conduct operations in Moscow. But Shadow had been operating out of the safe house for 14 months, running a network of assets that had been specifically chosen because they were so deeply embedded in Russian institutional structures that their compromise would fundamentally destabilize the entire Russian security apparatus. The operation was called Meridian. It was the most important intelligence network that the CIA had constructed in the past 2 decades. It was also, Shadow was beginning to suspect, the most elaborate trap ever devised. If you were in his position, would you have questioned the operation from the beginning? The message arrived at 06:47 a.m. through a secure channel that was supposed to be monitored only by the director, the deputy director, and Shadow's handler. The message contained a single instruction: eliminate all assets, destroy all communications equipment, prepare for emergency extraction. Shadow's hands trembled as he read the words, eliminate all assets. Not extract, not relocate, not secure, eliminate, which meant kill, which meant that the network he'd spent 14 months building, the network of operatives who'd risked their lives to provide intelligence about Russian military capabilities, the network of human beings who'd made themselves vulnerable to assassination in the service of American strategic interests, all of them were about to be executed. The implication was clear. Someone in the intelligence hierarchy had decided that the Meridian network was a liability. Someone had determined that the only way to protect American interests was to ensure that every asset who'd been read into the details of what they were actually doing was permanently silenced. Shadow had maybe 6 hours before the hunters arrived. 6 hours to decide whether he was going to follow orders and execute the people he'd been tasked with protecting, or whether he was going to become a traitor to the organization that had consumed his entire life. He made his first call at 07:13 a.m. His primary asset was a Russian military intelligence officer named Dmitry, who'd been compromised 3 years ago when the CIA had photographs of him with a man he wasn't supposed to be with. Dmitry had been given a choice: cooperate or watch his career, his family, and his life collapse in public disgrace. Dmitry had chosen cooperation. For 3 years, Dmitry had been feeding Shadow intelligence about Russian military operations, capabilities, and strategic doctrine. For 3 years, Dmitry had been a model asset, reliable, detailed, consistent. "Dmitry, this is Shadow," he said over the encrypted line. "Emergency Protocol Alpha. You need to disappear immediately. Destroy all communications equipment. Leave the country tonight." There was a pause. Then Dmitry's voice came back. "What happened?" "I can't explain over the line, but trust me, you need to leave Russia immediately. They've marked you for execution." Another pause. Then Dmitry said something that made Shadow's blood freeze. "They've already made contact. The FSB came to my apartment this morning. They knew everything, Shadow. They knew about me, they knew about the network, they knew about the operation. The only reason I'm still alive is because they want me to confirm that you're coming to extract me." Shadow's mind fragmented into pieces. The FSB knew. The FSB knew about the Meridian network. The FSB knew about the assets. The FSB knew about Shadow, which meant one of 2 things. Either Russian counterintelligence had somehow penetrated the network, or someone within the American intelligence hierarchy had deliberately exposed the network to the Russians. And if it was the second scenario, then the extraction message wasn't coming from the CIA. The extraction message was coming from Russian intelligence, trying to lure Shadow into a trap where he could be captured, interrogated, and executed. Would you recognize the moment when the trap was closing around you? Shadow hung up the phone and began the process of destroying his operational infrastructure. The encryption devices were shattered and flushed down a toilet. The physical files were burned in a metal basin. The safe house itself was wiped clean of any evidence that it had ever been occupied. By 09:30 a.m., Shadow had erased 14 months of operational activity, removing every trace of his presence in Moscow. But the question that kept repeating in Shadow's mind was, how did the Russians penetrate the network? How did they learn about Meridian? The operation was supposed to be compartmentalized. Only 3 people in the American intelligence hierarchy were supposed to know about it: the director, the deputy director, and Shadow's handler, Marcus Crawford. And Marcus Crawford had been Shadow's mentor for 12 years. Marcus Crawford had sponsored Shadow's recruitment into the CIA. Marcus Crawford had personally recommended Shadow for the most dangerous operations. Marcus Crawford was also Shadow's only contact in the intelligence hierarchy, which meant that if anyone was going to expose the network to the Russians, it would be Marcus Crawford. The realization hit Shadow like a physical blow. His handler was a double agent. His mentor was working for Russian intelligence. Everything Shadow had done over the past 14 months had been under the direction of someone who was actively working to compromise American intelligence operations. But that didn't make sense. Why would Marcus Crawford expose the Meridian network to the Russians? Why would Crawford compromise his own agents? Unless Crawford had never been Crawford's real handler, unless Crawford had been Russian intelligence from the beginning, unless Crawford had been placed inside the CIA specifically to identify and eliminate operatives who were building networks that threatened Russian security. Shadow made his way through Moscow using routes that he'd prepared years ago for exactly this contingency. The city that had been his operational base for 14 months was now a death trap. Every face he passed on the street could be Russian counterintelligence. Every car that lingered at a traffic light could be a hunter preparing to move in. Every apartment building could contain an assassination team waiting for him to pass through the door. By 14:30 p.m., Shadow had made it to a secondary safe house on the outskirts of the city. By 16 p.m., he'd accessed a stashed cache of documents that contained Marcus Crawford's personnel file, operational history, and financial records. What he found made his understanding of reality fracture completely. Marcus Crawford had been born in Moscow in 1962. Marcus Crawford had a Russian mother who'd worked for the KGB. Marcus Crawford had immigrated to the United States at age 18, but the immigration records were falsified. The entire identity was a construction. Marcus Crawford was a creation of Russian intelligence placed inside the CIA to serve as a sleeper asset, waiting for the moment when he could be activated to eliminate American intelligence networks. Shadow had been working for Russian intelligence for 12 years without knowing it. Every operation he'd executed, every asset he'd recruited, every intelligence he'd transmitted back to Washington, all of it had been monitored and controlled by a handler who was working for the Russians. The Meridian network hadn't been dismantled because it was a liability. The Meridian network had been dismantled because Shadow was finally becoming suspicious about the inconsistencies in his operational directives. The realization was absolute and terrifying. Shadow wasn't just a compromised operative. Shadow was a tool that Russian intelligence had been using to eliminate American intelligence networks and to identify operatives who were threatening to Russian security interests. The question that now haunted him was, how many other operatives in the intelligence community had been working under handlers who were actually Russian intelligence? How many networks had been compromised? How many assets had been executed because their handler was reporting to Moscow? Shadow made contact with the only person in the intelligence community who he thought might still be trustworthy, Deputy Director Patricia Morrison. Morrison had been vocal in her opposition to Crawford's operational directives. Morrison had argued against the Meridian expansion. Morrison had questioned Crawford's judgment on multiple occasions. "Deputy Director, this is Shadow," he said, over an encrypted line. "I need to meet with you. I have evidence that my handler is a Russian intelligence asset." Morrison's response was immediate. "Where are you?" "Moscow." "Then you're already dead," Morrison said bluntly. "If Crawford is Russian intelligence, then the extraction protocol is compromised. If you try to leave Russia through official channels, you'll be captured. If you try to leave through unofficial channels, Crawford will know about it and will have already positioned hunters to intercept you." "Then what do I do?" Shadow asked. "You survive," Morrison said. "You find a way to get out of Russia alive. Once you're out, you come to me with the evidence. Then we work together to identify every double agent in the intelligence hierarchy." Shadow spent the next 48 hours moving through the Russian criminal underworld, using contacts that had been built up over years of recruiting assets in Moscow. He purchased forged documents from a man who'd been working with the CIA for a decade. He paid a former KGB officer to arrange a border crossing into Finland. He became a ghost, moving through the shadows of Moscow like something that had already died and was just going through the motions of breathing. But the hunters were always one step behind him. The FSB had mobilized. Russian military counterintelligence was closing in. Every safe house he tried to access had already been compromised. Every contact he tried to make was already flagged. At hour 56, Shadow made it to the Finnish border. At hour 60, he crossed into Finland, leaving Russian territory behind, leaving Moscow behind, leaving 14 months of operational activity behind. By hour 70, he was in Helsinki, meeting with Deputy Director Morrison at a secure location that had been established through back channels that Morrison had constructed specifically for this contingency. "I have everything," Shadow told her, spreading the documents across the table. "Crawford's birth certificate, his immigration records, his KGB family connections, his financial transfers to Moscow. I have proof that he's a Russian intelligence asset. And if Crawford is compromised, then the handlers who recruited under Crawford are probably compromised too, which means we have multiple Russian intelligence assets embedded in the CIA." "How many operatives are affected?" Shadow asked. "I don't know yet," Morrison replied, "but we're going to find out. And when we do, we're going to burn down the entire structure that Crawford constructed and rebuild the intelligence community from the ground up. If you discovered that your entire life had been spent serving the enemy, could you ever trust your own judgment again?" Shadow was extracted to a secure location outside the country. He was debriefed for 72 hours straight by a team of intelligence officers who were cleared to know about the Crawford situation. He provided every detail he could remember about his operational directives, his interactions with Crawford, his suspicions about the Meridian network. By the time the debriefing was complete, the intelligence community had identified 43 operatives whose handlers had been trained by Crawford. 43 operatives were being brought into secure locations for protective custody and debriefing. But the larger implication was terrifying. Russian intelligence had successfully embedded 43 moles into the CIA. Russian intelligence had been systematically compromising American operations for more than a decade. Russian intelligence had been using the CIA as a tool to eliminate their own enemies and to identify American assets that threatened Russian security interests. And the machinery of government was only now beginning to understand the scope of the compromise. Shadow watched the news reports from his secure location. He watched as Deputy Director Morrison went public with the evidence. He watched as Marcus Crawford was arrested attempting to flee the country. He watched as the intelligence community went into crisis mode, as congressional hearings were convened, as the entire structure of American intelligence operations began to collapse under the weight of the mole hunt. But the victory felt hollow, because Shadow understood something that nobody else had yet grasped. If Russian intelligence had successfully embedded 43 moles into the CIA, Russian intelligence probably had moles in other American government agencies. Russian intelligence probably had moles in the Defense Department. Russian intelligence probably had moles in the State Department. Russian intelligence probably had moles everywhere that mattered. The Meridian network had just been one piece of a much larger operation. Shadow's exposure of the Crawford network had just been the first revelation. The machinery of institutional compromise went much deeper than anyone wanted to admit. And the question that would haunt Shadow for the rest of his life was whether he'd actually disrupted Russian intelligence operations, or whether he'd simply exposed a layer of the compromise while the deeper machinery continued to operate undetected.